In the skies over Germany in 1944, the Bf-109 was still taking off. American bomber formations were no longer coming in alone. They were now pushing deep into German airspace with long-range escort fighters beside them. And on the German side, one of the aircraft still doing the hard work of daytime air defense in large numbers was the Bf-109. One Bf-109 G-10 displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force wears the markings of JG-300, one of the Reich defense units. But the United States Strategic Bombing Survey put it far more brutally. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe had already begun to lose its effectiveness as a real fighting force. In other words, this aircraft was still flying late in the war, but what it was flying into was no longer the Luftwaffe at its peak. It was flying into its decline. That is what makes the Bf-109 worth talking about. Not simply whether it was good or bad, but how it managed to fight all the way from the Luftwaffe's rise to its collapse. It began life in the 1930s as part of Germany's fighter competition, and for its time, the design really was advanced. Retractable landing gear, an enclosed cockpit, automatic leading-edge slats, a cantilever wing, and semi-monocoque construction. None of that was backward. In testing, it beat the larger, heavier, and initially more favored HE-112, and it entered production in 1936. The RAF Museum sums it up well. The basic design had enough growth potential to keep accepting new engines and heavier armament, which is why it remained the backbone of German fighter units throughout the war. In the first half of the war, this aircraft genuinely earned its reputation. The RAF Museum describes the early Bf-109 as one of the best single-seat fighters in the world, and it had already proven itself in combat during the Spanish Civil War. By the time of the Battle of Britain, it was faster than the Hurricane and climbed better than both the Spitfire and the Hurricane. The Imperial War Museums also describe it as a clear threat to the Hurricane and a near-equal rival to the Spitfire. So the danger of the early Bf-109 was not some myth created by propaganda. British pilots ran into it in the sky and learned the hard way. But the Bf-109 was never the kind of aircraft that made everyone look good. Its strength was not the easy kind. In oral history collected by the Imperial War Museums, British veteran James Sanders argued that, in the hands of an experienced pilot, it was a deadly machine. German ace Günther Rall also admitted that the 109's landing gear was tall and narrow, and during takeoff, the pilot had to correct immediately for torque-induced swing, or things could go wrong very quickly. He also recalled that the cockpit was cramped and rear visibility was poor. In other words, what the Bf-109 gave to skilled pilots was sharpness. What it often gave to inexperienced pilots was punishment. And that punishment was not some small technical inconvenience from a manual. It translated directly into the odds of dying. The RAF Museum is very clear that the Bf-109 handled poorly on the ground. On the runway, that meant takeoffs and landings could go bad fast. In the air, poor rear visibility was not just a complaint. It meant you could be flying a very capable fighter and still never see the man who was about to kill you. A lot of people talk about the Bf-109's weaknesses as if they were just quirks, as if it was simply a bit awkward to fly. A better way to put it is this: its strengths had to be earned by skill, but its weaknesses came looking for you on their own. And the thing that truly shaped this aircraft's fate was not who turned tighter over Britain. It was how long the aircraft could stay there at all. The RAF Museum puts it bluntly. In the Battle of Britain, the Bf-109's greatest handicap was its limited fuel capacity. Another RAF Museum page goes even further and gives the number that really matters. Over southeast England, Bf-109 pilots often had only around 20 minutes of combat time. And what does 20 minutes mean? It means the aircraft might be able to escort bombers into the target area, but not protect them all the way back out through the danger zone. It means German fighter pilots were often forced to turn for home, not because they were beaten, but because the fuel gauge was making the decision for them. In escort warfare, that is not a footnote. That is where people start dying. But the story is still more complicated than that, because when the enemy captured a Bf-109 and flew it themselves, they often came away admitting the same thing. This was a serious aircraft. The RAF Museum's Black 6 archive makes that very clear. A Bf-109G captured in North Africa in 1942 was test-flown by RAF and RAAF pilots, and R.H. Gibbs recorded a very high opinion of its performance in his diary. By December 1942, one test pilot described it as a very good performer, and even left behind the memory that it seemed better than anything they themselves had at hand at that moment. By 1944, the captured machine was still being used in comparative flying against the Mustang III, Spitfire 9, and Spitfire 14. You do not have to like the 109, but when even its enemies treat it as something worth studying carefully, that alone tells you it was never just a paper legend. Its place in the memory of the Eastern Front only deepened that sense of legend. In oral history from Walter Krupinski, preserved by the Imperial War Museums, you can see a typical Bf-109 pilot career laid out almost like a map of the Luftwaffe's war. France, Britain, the Soviet Union, then Northwest Europe in 1944, and finally the defense of Germany itself. The testimony does not turn the Bf-109 into a fantasy machine, but it does make one thing very clear. The Bf-109 was not just the star of one famous campaign. It was the everyday working platform of the German fighter arm, the airframe behind thousands of sorties, rough airfields, Eastern Front attrition, and relentless operational tempo. What follows is an inference based on that service pattern. It became tied so tightly to the idea of the German ace because it was used so widely, so continuously, and for so long. The problem is that being usable for a long time is not the same thing as being suitable forever. The RAF Museum makes the point clearly. The Bf-109's basic design had enough capacity to absorb new engines and heavier guns. In the first half of the war, that was an advantage, because Germany could keep upgrading it and keep it competitive. But in the second half of the war, that also meant Germany was loading more and more demands onto an aging airframe. This is not to say that the late war 109 was useless. It is to say that it increasingly resembled an old veteran being forced into overtime, still capable of fighting, but paying more for it every year. After 1944, that cost was no longer just a squadron commander's complaint. It became the suffocating reality of the entire system. United States Air Force Academy research on Point Blank argues that Big Week and the weeks that followed effectively broke the backbone of the German fighter force as an effective combat arm. By April 1, 1944, the Anglo-American air forces had gained air superiority over Germany, and they never gave it back. The irony is that the United States Strategic Bombing Survey also showed that German single-engine fighter production was still climbing in 1944 and even peaked in September. But only a fraction of those aircraft actually reached combat. Large numbers were lost in transit, destroyed on the ground, or simply left unable to fight because there was not enough fuel, not enough trained pilots, or not enough functioning structure left to turn production into combat power. That is where the late war tragedy of the Bf-109 really appears. The problem was not always that Germany failed to build the aircraft. The problem was that Germany no longer had enough Germany left to turn it into an effective weapon. That is also why so many people are lazy when they talk about the Bf-109 today. One kind of laziness turns it into Germany's ultimate wonder fighter. The other kind goes the opposite way and shrugs that by the late war it was already finished. Both miss the point. The Imperial War Museums give the hard facts. The Bf-109 was built in more than 34,000 examples over 8 years, making it the most produced fighter in history. It served in roles ranging from escort work to night fighting and ground attack. And for the first years of the war, it was Germany's most important single-seat fighter. Its reputation is not big simply because of performance. Its reputation is big because it was everywhere. But being everywhere is not the same thing as being equally effective in every phase of the war.
So what was the Bf-109 really? My judgment is this. It was not a perfect fighter. It was a fighter that was almost perfectly suited to the first half of the war and then dragged by force into the second half of the war long after the conditions had changed. Early on, it was like a knife, light, fast, and vicious, especially in the hands of experienced pilots. In the middle years, it stayed lethal through constant upgrades. Late in the war, it was still flying, but it had become less a symbol of German strength than a symbol of German exhaustion. Calling it useless is lazy. Calling it unbeatable is worse. What makes the Bf-109 worth remembering is that it stayed with the Luftwaffe from its sharpest moment all the way to its point of collapse. The legend was real. The aging was real too. And because both things are true at the same time, the Bf-109 remains one of the hardest aircraft in World War II aviation history to sum up in a single sentence.